Welcome to Generous Theology. Chuck and Brock take a break from reading material today and talk about their own personal experiences in Christian life.
I'm thinking of a couple of things here, and there's a sense in which, at times, I recognize in my own tradition that on occasion we lose sight of that. And sometimes those of us who come from the Kuyperian tradition within the Dutch Reformed community get accused of sort of triumphalism, of this idea that because the kingdom is so large, because there is not a single square inch of all creation that Jesus does not claim his, we sometimes get accused of missing the evil side of that antithesis. And so that concept of the antithesis is a good reminder that even as we have the ability to learn from all sorts of thinkers, including non-Christian thinkers, there is also a sense that we still have to remember that not only does all of reality have structure, a way that it's built, but that everything also has a direction. And when you're talking about an antithesis, it's one way or the other. It's either the direction is either towards God's will or away from God's will. And that idea of the antithesis puts some guides down, puts some boundaries down on getting too far into that triumphalistic way of thinking that sometimes we Kuyperian folks have gotten into. On the other hand, it does enable us, and I have felt that I've been very fortunate to be open to learning from others. And so I'm going to give you one particular example. So in my testimony, I talked a little bit about my mother converting from Catholicism and my paternal grandfather as well. And I will say my paternal grandfather remained, after he became a Protestant Christian, remained rather negative towards Catholicism and never changed. But my mother, not so much. And I think as well, what I have found is that while certainly I don't accept certain basic tenets of Roman Catholic theology, there are some real differences. I have found, for example, in understanding that there are ways we can learn from others with whom we don't necessarily share every single book. I have found that in certain areas of study related to the law, related to politics, I have found a great deal in Roman Catholic writers and in Roman Catholic philosophers and thinkers that have been really helpful in shaping where I am on this. And that even gets into earlier talking about that sense of community. I know that there are a number of Catholic theologians and philosophers, many of them pre-modern, but some of them more towards this century, who really focus on some of those ideas of community. What is the common good? And there's been much that I've learned from those folks that has been really helpful. That has impacted me in very specific ways, in very concrete ways, even in my involvement, for example, in the pro-life movement. As Roman Catholics have been really, in many ways, they've been the leaders pro-life, first to really see the problems with Roe v. Wade. There were some Protestants who saw that very early on in the 70s. It really was the Roman Catholics leading the charge. And my involvement now in pro-life, especially in what some people call the non-traditional pro-life movement, which tries to get these pro-life ideas in the minds and the hearts of people who don't otherwise always feel aligned with folks in the pro-life, and thereby broadening the scope of the pro-life movement and hopefully broadening the appeal of it. There's been much that I've learned from Catholic thinkers and just from everyday Catholics as well in dealing with those issues. And if we were to just decide that, no, we can't learn from them, they're on the wrong side of that antithesis, rather than this runs through us, rather than just putting some people on one side and some people on the other. I may not have had those same kind of opportunities and that same opportunity to learn from others. So that's one sort of concrete example on how that's played out.
Yeah, I will share one way in which exploring the antithesis has made me richer. Now, when I first joined the online Reformed community, this was sometime around the year 2000 to maybe around 2002 or 2003. Sometime in those first 2 or 3 years is when I became Reformed and when I joined the online community. And right from the beginning, and I've talked with you about this, Chuck, before, I really felt like my life was a replay of the movie Tommy Boy, in that I felt like I was Tommy Boy when I came online and found my Reformed brothers on all of these bulletin boards, mailing lists, all the different sort of pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter, pre-modern social media platforms that were around. I was like, brothers gotta hug. Wanted to have this love fest. Now that I had found my family, my kinfolk, my Calvinist cousins online, and just the character Rob Lowe plays in the Tommy Boy movie. I forget the character's name, but the actor's Rob Lowe has this disdain for Chris Farley's character Tommy Boy. He has contempt for him. He despises him. The last thing he wants to do is be seen with him. And that's really how it was in a significant measure. Now, I'm going to talk about that side of things. There were many folks in the Reformed community who greeted me and welcomed me and loved me. So I don't want to make it sound like it's a universal thing, but there was this rejecting, pushing away force that I felt right from the beginning. And one of the ways in which I found the antithesis to strengthen me was when I talked with those community members. Not only was it a sin to commit things that the Bible said were sins, but there were a whole lot of extra faux pas that were practically sins. And one of them was that you couldn't read outside of the narrow orthodoxy that those folks held to. Why would you want to read Berkouwer, that modernistic compromiser that he was? Why would you want to read any non-Christian? Why would you want to read any non-Reformed? Why would you want to even read some of the Reformed folks who were quote-unquote squishy? So even back then, there was just this intensely strong pushback that I never anticipated. And what I found was the more people in the Calvinist community, and this narrow tent orthodoxy, the more they told me not to read a certain book, the more I thought, there's something in here, not for me to read and adopt confessionally, not to confess. For example, Karl Barth, if I would have mentioned that I had a book of his in my library, even if it's only for critical purposes, that would be just tantamount to being a Roman Catholic, which would be tantamount to being a non-believer, except possibly worse. There was just this very reactionary experience. And what I found was in most cases, first of all, the Reformed view and it held. So for example, there are strong reasons to reject the theology of Karl Barth. And I don't think that anybody should get confused about the theology of non-believers. But at the very same time, there was, in the antithesis, in having those books in my library and reading through them and having to weigh them against my confessional positions, it really helped me grow. And my point here is that as I added these forbidden non-reformed works into my library, the dimensions of my theological maturity just went through the roof and made it was so enriching. And so that was an example of the antithesis. And if I ever see somebody online and they're ready to anathematize me because they don't like the contents of my library, I have found that I should maybe consider reading, or if not reading, at least finding out what's going on with that author. Maybe the author has something productive to say, maybe not. These books that I added that were quote unquote forbidden, I didn't add, like I said, as a confessional standard, but as with an eye towards criticism and critique. And I think that's been somewhat lost. And so there's an avenue there where one can learn by looking outside of one's tradition. Now, another way in which this antithesis is pulled is by listening to your critics. If there's one thing that hardly anybody does well, and this is not particularly a knock against Reformed people, because I don't think any tribalistic-minded sets of people do well here, and that is listening to what the other person you're engaging with is saying. We have plenty of people talking past each other. We hardly have anybody actually listening and engaging with the thesis of the other side. It's infuriating when I write a post that I think is well-researched, has some citations, has some heft and meat to the bone, and the opponent I'm interacting with responds as if I didn't even say anything. And so, of course, the thought comes to me that if I do that, I don't think I should expect a good outcome. But what I have found is that a lot of criticism has interesting points to it, and there is great gain in listening to someone criticizing your views, even if you don't end up agreeing with their criticisms, or you maybe want to reject them ultimately. I have found that there is oftentimes much more there than maybe I would have naively ever dared to want to admit. And so that's another example of the antithesis, the idea that there is gain in loss, that one can do things in a manner that might seem to be bad for your educational outcomes, but in fact turns out to be an opportunity for explosive growth and maturity. So that's really motivated and moved me a lot in these discussions. Now, I'm not asking you to get polemical, because I've talked in a lot of polemical terms. When you're talking with people and you're interacting, first of all, what contexts are you typically engaging with people in the marketplace of ideas? And second of all, what are some of the sort of things that you're finding lead to the best outcomes and promote godliness and wholesomeness the most?